Hello, everyone. Welcome to the CPACE Performance Instructional Leadership Study Guide. My name is Shane Forgerson. I'm going to be walking you through the different parts of the CPACE. We're going to break down each section of it, question by question, and review the sample response and see how we can formulate our answers to best answer the questions on the exam. So for the first written assignment in the CPACE Performance, you will be asked to review 8 exhibits, including a video recorded segment of a teacher's instruction, about 12 to 15 minutes in length, and then provide a written analysis of the teacher's effectiveness. In the instructional leadership section of the CPACE Performance, it will be broken down into 3 different subsections. The first being engaging and supporting students in learning. Number 2 is assessing student learning. And number 3 is developing as a professional educator. In the CPACE, you can break down your answer into 3 different subsections, and underneath each one of those subsections, you can create an outline for yourself using all of the questions and just format those questions into answer response format. So we're going to discuss that a little bit in the following slides. Before you dive into anything on the CPACE, what I recommend is going to the navigation of the CPACE and reviewing the documents prior to watching the video. You typically only have one chance to watch the video of the recorded lesson, so it's important that you actually go over all the documents and figure out what your game plan is prior to watching the lesson. Then you want to create an outline, even prior to watching the lesson, of what your answer is going to look like. Again, breaking it down into those 3 subsections, and then creating your outline using the questions, but formatting them in answer response style. So here I've included a flowchart that might help you when you're formulating your outline, and it breaks it down into the 3 sections of engaging, assessing, and developing. And then underneath those 3 sections are the topics of clear objectives, student engagement and learning, appropriate pedagogy, and addressing learning needs. For assessing, there is effectively monitoring learning and providing feedback, assessing student mastery, using the results of student monitoring and assessment. And then under developing, we have 1 instructional strength, 2 areas of improvement, using info provided by the teacher's self-reflection, and strategies that lead to improved teaching and learning, and then finally, monitoring growth. So you can use this flowchart to inform your outline. And what's important about it is that within this flowchart, I've included different documents and artifacts, including the video and lesson plans, reflections, student work samples, TPEs, to help you be able to build in citations into your answers. It's important to always cite everything that you include in your answer. When you make a claim, you need to be able to back it up by clear evidence, and that clear evidence is going to be found somewhere within the artifacts. The grading criteria for engaging and supporting students in learning is going to be based on the following. Number 1, explaining how the instructional plan was effective in promoting student engagement and student learning. Number 2, describing how appropriate content-specific pedagogy was exhibited during the lesson. And number 3, describing how variations in learning needs and developmental levels of students were addressed during the lesson. So let's take a look at question number 1 from engaging and supporting students in learning. The question states, were the lesson objectives clear and reflective of California's state-adopted K-12 academic content standards and frameworks? You're going to answer this question in 3 sentences. And again, it asked if the lesson objectives were clear and reflective of the state standards. So you need to figure out what the state standards were that the lesson was trying to achieve. And you need to figure out if the lesson objectives were clear and reflected those state standards. Typically, you're going to find the state standards listed somewhere in the lesson plan. And then you're going to use the lesson plan as well as the video to figure out if the objectives were clear, if they were stated during the lesson, and if they were reflective of the standards. You can think of the acronym CARK or CARK for clear, aligned to California standards, reviewed with students, and key vocabulary reviewed. What's important about this is that the students understand the objectives and it's clear that they understand the objectives. So, how did the teacher go about this? Did they write the objectives on the whiteboard? Did they have some sort of PowerPoint or slideshow that had the objectives on it? Did the students say them out loud? Did they write them down? Did the teacher say the objectives out loud? And how do you know if the students knew what the lesson objectives were? And then were those lesson objectives actually aligned with the state standards? Typically, in the lesson plan, the teacher will align their lesson objectives with the state standards because that's common practice. But sometimes in the lesson, even though they plan to have those objectives be clear, they're not actually stated in the lesson. So watch out for what was planned versus what was actually implemented and observed in the lesson. So I want to go ahead and read from the CTCE example of the strong sample response that's included on the CPACE website. And it states, Teacher A's lesson objectives were reflective of California's adopted academic standards for first grade. Lesson plan. The objectives were visible on the student's workout packet, and Teacher A reviewed essential vocabulary words landmark and monument with the students during the motivation portion of the lesson. Video. Neglecting to identify objectives with students has been noted and discussed with Teacher A. Notes from previous walkthroughs. So you'll notice that they use three different artifacts or documents to back up the claims that were made in this answer. The first one was the lesson plan. So they took a look at the lesson plan and figured out if the objectives were reflective of the standards. So once they found out that they were reflective of the standards, they needed to figure out were they stated during the lesson or visible to the students. So it says they were visible in the workout packet, and the teacher reviewed the essential vocabulary that had to do with the objectives. And those vocabulary words were landmark and monument. And that was during the motivation portion of the lesson. And that was all found in the video of the teacher teaching. There is one thing that the teacher has identified that they have neglected to do, and that is from previous walkthroughs, we've seen that the teacher neglects to identify objectives with students, and that has been discussed and noted in the walkthroughs. So make sure that you look at all the documents, including previous walkthroughs, because it might give you some clues as to something that the teacher is working toward and a goal that could help them in their growth. Let's take a look at question number 2, engaging and supporting students in learning. The question states, to what extent was the teacher's instructional plan, including activities and materials, effective in promoting student engagement and student learning? This is going to be a pretty long section, and you're going to answer this in 6 to 10 sentences. So you really need to think of how the teacher's instructional plan, including activities and materials, was effective in promoting student engagement and learning. You're looking for how students were engaged, and you're looking for how well did they learn during the lesson. So, first of all, you need to think of the lesson plan. Does the lesson plan support or promote student engagement and learning? You need to think about were the objectives aligned with the state standards? What was the pacing like of the lesson plan? What type of activities did they have in the lesson? Then you need to really reflect on the video. Were these things in the lesson plan evident in the video? Or were there things that were planned but that were never implemented? You need to think about the classroom management that was happening during the lesson. You need to think about the pacing. How was the teacher moving throughout the lesson? And how well were the students responding to that pacing? Did they look like they were following? Did they look like they were getting bored? Were they confused? Or were they engaged throughout the entire lesson? You need to think about all the activities that were visible during the lesson and how those activities promoted or did not promote student learning and engagement. For this answer, you can use the following sentence frames to help you build your answer. Quote, the teacher's instructional plan was designed to meet specific standard. Quote, the instructional plan, including activities and materials, was or was not effective in promoting student engagement and learning because. Make sure that you reference things like lesson rigor, classroom management, classroom culture, routine, teacher and student talk time, and student work time. It's important that the lesson is student focused instead of teacher focused. So if you're observing that the teacher is doing a lot of the talking, that it's just mostly lecture, that there's not a lot of activities where the students are doing different grouping activities, or maybe they're doing hands-on activities, or they're able to have discussions during the class, or they're rotating to different stations. If you are seeing that it's mostly just teacher focused as opposed to student focused, then you need to make sure that you note that and how that had an effect on student learning. So let's take a look at the strong sample response from the CTCE website. It states, Teacher A's instructional plan was designed to meet History Social Science Standard 1.3 and accompany the state-adopted textbooks lesson plan. However, there was a discrepancy between the written plan and the actual lesson observed. For instance, the focus questions, lesson plan, were not asked in the lesson, video. The expected learning outcomes were not reflected in the lesson, video, or on the social studies test, student work. Several planned events did not occur in the lesson observed, including the following: explaining the key concepts of the lesson, vocabulary activities, coloring a picture of the United States and label the landmarks discussed in the lesson, and accommodation for English learners, lesson plan, video, student work samples. The instructional plan, including activities and materials, was partially effective in promoting student engagement and learning because several important steps were not completed in the procedures portion of the lesson plan, and classroom management issues occurred, which affected time on task behaviors. Lesson plan, video, teacher reflection. Notice how the answer contains 6 core sentences and 4 bullet points, with each claim referencing an exhibit of some sort. This answer discusses planned versus observed and is backed up by clear evidence. In promoting student engagement and learning, ask yourself the following questions. Did the lesson go according to plan? What were the differences between the lesson plan and the observed lesson? Which aspects of the lesson plan were neglected? How did this have an impact on student engagement and learning? How effective was the lesson plan and observed lesson in promoting student engagement and learning? It's important that we always relate everything that we do back to student engagement and learning during this section. So if you make a claim about something that happened, how did that affect student engagement and learning? Let's take a look at question number 3 from engaging and supporting students in learning. To what extent did the teacher exhibit appropriate content-specific pedagogy in the lesson? Answer this one in 2 to 4 sentences. Think about student-focused teaching, appropriate content and developmental level, questions and checks for understanding, realistic and age-appropriate expectations, student-led learning, positive on-task student behavior. So to what extent did the teacher exhibit appropriate content-specific pedagogy in the lesson? Now, this wording is a little bit tricky because what appropriate means is it means grade level appropriate and age level appropriate, and content specific means that the type of teaching was geared toward the actual lesson objectives and the California state standards that were trying to be achieved. So it's developmentally appropriate, and the type of activities were promoting content specific objectives. So for this section, you can think of best practices such as modeling, using visual aids, grouping strategies, collaboration, using technology, choral repetition, hands-on activities, using graphic organizers, and just differentiation of instruction in general. You're going to find this stuff in the lesson plan, in the video, and the teacher reflection. What's really helpful is to look at the teacher reflection and to see what did the teacher say about their own lesson, and how can you use what they said about their own lesson to figure out what they did well and what they could improve upon. So in the reflection, you will probably find something that's said about the extent to which they exhibited appropriate content specific pedagogy, or just their teaching style in general, and how that was geared toward the developmental level, the grade level of the students, and was geared toward achieving those lesson objectives. You can use the following sentence frames to help build your answer. Quote, appropriate content specific pedagogy was, or was not, evident in this lesson. Quote, developmentally appropriate pedagogy was observed with. Let's take a look at the strong sample response to this question. Appropriate content specific pedagogy was evident in the lesson, including asking questions, checking for understanding, using visual aids, and engaging students by pretending to go on a bus trip to visit landmarks. Lesson plan, video. Developmentally inappropriate pedagogy was observed, including teacher A doing most of the talking, students off task with many verbal reminders, and unrealistic expectations for the amount of time first graders can sit and listen. Video, teacher reflection. So notice how the question is answered in two sentences with specific examples and references given in each sentence. The answer highlights the positive content specific pedagogy and the teaching strategies used by the teacher, as well as addresses the areas where the lesson fell short of expectations. The things that were positive were student focused, and that was pretending to go on a bus trip and visit landmarks, asking questions, checking for understanding, usually using the visual aids. All of those are helpful to students, and it helped them stay on task, and it helped them with their learning experience. This example is from a first grade class. So the teacher was doing a lot of the talking and was expecting the students to sit and stay focused on the lesson during this lesson. And so it's noted that there was unrealistic expectations for the amount of time that their first graders can sit and listen during a lesson. So that's something that did not help students learn. So it's considered inappropriate pedagogy because it's not appropriate for the grade level to have the teacher doing most of the talking, as opposed to having the students do more hands-on activities. Whereas the teacher might do a quick introduction to the lesson and then have a guided practice or some sort of activity that the students are doing. But the bus trip, pretending to go on a bus trip and visiting landmarks, was helpful because students at this level, developmentally, love to use their imaginations. And so it was helpful for them to imagine them going on a trip and visiting different landmarks. Question number 4 from engaging and supporting students in learning. Describe how the teacher addressed variations in learning needs and developmental levels of students, including, if applicable, learning needs of English learners and students with special needs within the lesson. You're going to answer this question in 3 to 5 sentences, and you're going to address various learning needs within the answer. So it's important to take a look at the class profile and always start your answer with who is in the class before you talk about how the teacher addressed those students. So you could use a sentence frame such as, the teacher's class includes, and then you actually just list off who's in the class, the different types of learners that are in the class, and the types of learners that the teacher is teaching to. Then you need to think about the types of needs that those students have, and you need to talk about how the teacher addressed those needs in the classroom. So, did they implement accommodations? Did they differentiate instruction to meet the needs of all students? Did they strategize with different grouping strategies to help put students together that might have the same needs so that the teacher can come and address those needs? Or did they pair students who are high achieving with other students who need extra support, so that they can have some of the students be in more of a leadership role and some of the students have peer support? Did they do extension activities for the students, maybe if students are gifted and they need more challenging work during the class, or if they need extra support with particular activities where they need help on a specific type of activity and they need an extension on that? And what sort of plan supports did the teacher have in their lesson plan? And then were those planned supports and accommodations observed during the lesson? So you're going to look at the class profile, the lesson plan, the video, and the teacher reflection to figure out all this information. It's important to note what was planned versus what was implemented. A lot of the time in the lesson plan, the teacher will list a bunch of stuff that will address the students' individual needs. But then when you actually watch the video, you don't see any of those things that they planned actually being implemented in the lesson. So it's really important to view the lesson plan prior to watching the video so you can look out for those things that you can note in your head. Maybe they planned for specific needs of students, and I'm going to actually see if those were implemented throughout the lesson. Another sentence frame that you can use: the teacher did or did not implement the planned supports and accommodations, such as blank. So you can figure out which accommodations the teacher planned for and how or how did they not implement those supports. Let's take a look at the strong sample response from the CTCE website. Teacher A's class includes 3 English learners, EL, 2 students with specific learning disabilities, 1 student with attention deficit/hyperactivity disorder, and 1 autistic student with full-time paraprofessional. Class profile, walkthroughs. 1/3 of the class is above grade level in reading, and 1/3 is at grade level in reading. Class profile. Teacher A had planned for differentiating instruction for her ELs, lesson plan, but these actions were not observed. Video. Teacher A noted that the students did well on the social studies test, student work sample, and, quote, I think I could have set higher expectations or had extension activities that were a bit more challenging, end quote. Teacher reflection. Variations in learning needs were not addressed in the final work product, student work sample, as well as all students completed the same assignment without any modifications or extension activities. So notice how the answer begins by listing students with specific needs from the class profile, as well as list data from the overall achievement levels of the class as a whole. The answer then goes on to explain how differentiation was planned for, but not observed, and variations in learning needs were not addressed in the final work product. This answer is 5 sentences long and uses specific references from multiple exhibits, including the class profile, the walkthroughs, probably to see that they had a full-time paraprofessional for the autistic student, as well as the video and the teacher reflection, the student work samples, and the lesson plan. So there's a lot of artifacts that are actually referenced and cited in this sample answer. Moving on to subsection 2 of the Instructional Leadership CPACE. Assessing student learning, grading criteria. Number 1, you will be graded on describing how the teacher monitored student learning, provided feedback to students, and assessed student mastery of the learning objectives. And number 2, describing how the teacher used the results of student monitoring and assessment. Question number 1 for assessing student learning. How effectively did Teacher A monitor student learning and provide feedback to students during the lesson? You're going to answer this question in 3 to 5 sentences, and you're going to think about how the teacher monitored the students. So these can be things like questions. Was the teacher asking questions? And how were they answering the questions, and what type of questions were they? Were they wide range questions? Were they high level questions? Were they specific questions? Were they cold calling students? Were they pulling sticks out of a jar? Were they looking at a roster and just randomly calling on students? Or were they just asking a question and seeing whose hand was raised and then choosing those students who were raising their hand? Were they circulating around the classroom and helping students individually? What type of movement did you see in the classroom? Did they have discussions? Was it a whole class discussion, small groups, partners? Did they have any parent share happen? Was the teacher using whiteboards? Write your answer on a whiteboard, then hold it up. Were they saying, show me a thumbs up or a thumbs down, true or false? What type of monitoring did they do to see if the students were learning and were actually grasping the concepts that they were teaching in their lesson? And then you need to also think about how they provided feedback. If a student answered a question in a particular way, specifically if they had the wrong answer to a question, how did the teacher address that? Did they clarify the answer? Did they have follow up questions because they knew that students weren't understanding? So, did they follow up with other questions? Did they reframe their questions? Did they just simply state the answer? Did they call in another student to help that student out? Did they offer suggestions or compliments during learning? So if students were answering questions in a way that was correct, were they offering compliments? If students were doing work as a class or doing things on whiteboards and holding them up, how did the teacher address what they were doing? You need to note the frequency of the feedback. How much feedback was the teacher giving the students? And then you need to think about what type of feedback was the teacher giving the students? Was it mostly behavioral? Was it just addressing classroom management type of stuff? Or was it feedback on their actual learning? You can use the sentence frames for monitoring. The teacher monitored learning through, and for feedback, the teacher's feedback to students consisted of. You're going to find all this kinds of stuff in the lesson plan, in the video, and in the reflection and the walkthrough. And make sure that you cite those particular artifacts or those exhibits in your answer. So let's take a look at the example from the CTCE website of the strong sample response to this question. During the lesson, Teacher A monitored learning through questioning and provided minimal feedback to students. Teacher A asked multiple questions throughout the lesson. However, they were not higher level thinking questions. For instance, who can tell me what a landmark is? And who could tell me if you know where we live? Video, which requires simple recall. The teacher A's feedback to the students consisted of comments on behavior, not on learning. Video. Notice how the sample answer describes how the teacher monitored learning and provided feedback. The answer also goes into detail about the monitoring strategy, stating that the questions were not higher level thinking. Specific examples from the exhibits were provided for reference with an explanation to support the claim. The answer also includes what type of feedback the teacher used and references the video. Question number 2 from assessing student learning. How did Teacher A assess student mastery of the learning objectives for the lesson/unit? You're going to answer this question in 3 to 4 sentences. Think about which particular tasks the students completed. Was it answering questions? Was it completing classwork? Was it exit tickets? Were there different activities involved that the teacher used to assess whether or not the students were grasping the concepts that were taught throughout the lesson? You need to think about what the teacher planned. So you can use the sentence frame. The teacher's planned assessments included, but also make sure that you talk about whether or not the teacher implemented what they planned during the lesson. So if you see something in the lesson that was planned for assessing student mastery, but was never implemented during the lesson and wasn't clear in the video, sometimes you might find it in the reflection or you might find it in the student work samples where they actually did have the students complete a worksheet and that was found in the student work samples, or in the reflection they might talk about some sort of quiz that they gave the students and reflect on that. But if there's no documentation or there's no evidence that the things that the teacher planned were actually implemented in the lesson, you can talk about how the teacher planned for these assessments, but they were never actually implemented. So make sure that you look through all the documents, including lesson plan, videos, student work samples, teacher reflection, so that you can be very clear on what was planned versus implemented. Let's take a look at the CTCE example of the strong sample response. Planned assessment included answering questions during guided practice, coloring a map of the United States, and labeling landmarks discussed during guided practice, and completing a worksheet, lesson plan. Students' mastery of some of the learning objectives for this lesson was met during the lesson. For instance, answering verbal questions and completing a worksheet, lesson plan, student work samples, video. The map was missing from the lesson, video, and the expected learning outcomes, lesson plan, were not observed. So again, this is planned versus implemented. There were some things that were planned that were actually not observed during the lesson. So notice how the sample answer describes which tasks were completed by students for assessment purposes. The answer also analyzes whether or not students obtained mastery of the learning objectives during the lesson and gives examples to support its claim. The answer also details planned versus observed. Question number 3 from Assessing Student Learning. How did Teacher A use the results of student monitoring and assessment? You're going to answer this in 1 to 2 sentences, and you need to think about what types of adaptations and how did the teacher adjust to the results of the student monitoring and assessment. So think about, how did the teacher clarify any misconceptions that the students had? Did they have additional modeling when they saw with their monitoring process that the students weren't grasping the concepts? Did they include more or less learning activities? Did they skip unnecessary activities? How did they review the data and then use that data to adjust in the future and help to identify spots that the students needed extra help in, or to find out that the students actually did obtain mastery during the lesson? You can use the sentence frame: the teacher did or did not use the results of student monitoring during the lesson to guide instruction. And you're going to use the video, student work samples, reflection, and lesson plan to figure out whether or not the teacher used the results of student monitoring and assessment in a way that helps to guide their instruction and help them to make adaptations and adjustments during and after instruction. So let's take a look at the strong sample response. Teacher A minimally used the results of student monitoring during the lesson to guide her instruction. Teacher A used the results of the end of lesson assessment, student work samples, to ascertain that the lesson objectives had been met, teacher reflection. Notice how the sample answer directly makes a claim about whether or not the teacher used the results of monitoring to guide her instruction, and then follows up with how the assessment was used with included references. Moving on to subcategory number 3, developing as a professional educator. The grading criteria for this section is the following. Number 1, explaining an instructional strength demonstrated and identifying 2 areas for improvement. Number 2, identifying recommended strategies to improve instruction and describing how these strategies will lead to improved teaching and learning. And number 3, describing effective strategies to monitor teacher professional growth and student learning. Question number 1 from Developing as a Professional Educator. Based on your analysis and on information provided in the artifacts and documents, explain one instructional strength demonstrated by Teacher A and identify 2 specific areas for improvement. So you're going to answer this in 3 sentences, and it almost seems counterintuitive, but you want to make sure that 2 sentences are focused on the strength of the teacher, and then the third sentence is simply going to be the areas that the teacher can improve upon. You're going to go into detail on these areas of improvement later on in your essay. So making sure that that's really just clear and concise, and which areas they need for improvement in one clear sentence, and making sure to cite the TPEs for each one of those areas of improvement is really important. So your strength is actually going to take up the bulk of this answer. For your one instructional strength, you're going to look through the TPEs, which is typically a document included in the documents section, and you're going to think about what went well for the teacher. What did they do to lead to positive outcomes for the students? Was it their classroom management? Was it differentiation, lesson planning, organization? Were they asking high-level thinking questions? Did they use grouping strategies? Did they use technology? You're going to think about a specific strength that reflects one of the TPEs. And then the same thing for the 2 areas of improvement. You're going to find those areas of improvement in the TPEs, but make sure that it's related to the actual teacher and their lesson. So think about their classroom management, their differentiation, their lesson planning, their organization, classroom behavior. How did things not go so well, or how could they have gone better for the teacher during this lesson? And what are some areas that you could help support this teacher in to help them improve in the classroom and to help support their students in learning, engagement, and achievement? So let's take a look at the strong sample response. An answer to this question. One of Teacher A's instructional strengths is planning an appropriate lesson. Lesson plan, teacher reflection, that reflects state standards, demonstrates a logical progression, and allows for accommodations for ELs. Teacher A was organized and prepared. Video. Two specific areas for improvement are classroom management and differentiating instruction. So notice how the sample response describes in detail the strength of the teacher and references the artifacts, and then goes on to simply list the areas for improvement. Again, you're going to go into great detail on these areas for improvement later on in your essay. So you don't need to spend a lot of time talking about them in this particular question. You just need to answer what the two areas are that you observed, and just make sure that that answer is based on something that you found in the lesson plan, in the video, and the two of them combined, and that they're informed by the TPEs. Question number 2 from Developing as a Professional Educator. As principal, what strategies would you recommend to teacher A to improve the teacher's instruction? You're going to think about 2 to 3 strategies for each one of the areas for improvement. And it's best to just think of best practices when you're thinking about these strategies. So if you build on your experience in the classroom, what do you think is best practice in the classroom? And how could you offer suggestions to this teacher to help improve their instruction that could lead to positive outcomes for students? So practices could include the objectives being posted, read aloud, so that the students are clear about the learning objectives. Making sure that the learning objectives are clear in a lesson is super important. Integrating technology, classroom management, expectations clear and posted in the classroom. Establishing routines for classroom management purposes. Different questioning techniques. So, do you have cold calling, pulling sticks out of a jar? Are you calling names from a roster? What kind of questioning strategies are you using to keep students engaged? Are you strategizing your grouping? Are you increasing your rigor in your expectations? Are you checking for understanding, differentiating instruction? Are you using sentence frames and guided notes? What type of best practices could you think of that could be strategies to help this teacher improve their instruction, and recommendations that you can make for the things that you found could be improved? You're going to use information provided by the teacher's self reflection to help you in these recommendations. So, in the teacher's self reflection, typically you will find somewhere that the teacher talks about an area where they think that they could have done better. And that's a great one to use as something that you found for the teacher to improve upon. And usually that can be found in the teacher reflection and also in the actual observed lesson. So the two will actually coincide with each other, where you see something that the teacher knows is an area for improvement and that you actually observed was an area for improvement. And then you just need to think of some best practices strategies that you can write about that would help the teacher in that specific area. So here's the strong sample response for that question. As principal, I would recommend several classroom management strategies. To begin a lesson, objectives should be clearly posted, read aloud, and students should chorally read them aloud. Students are then focused on the lesson. The teacher can integrate technology to assist with time management by using the smartboard to display the focus questions, making connections, and vocabulary activities, all of which were planned for but not delivered. Technology can engage students with the lessons with visuals and interactive features and help to minimize behavioral issues. Some students were off task during the lesson, which can be prevented by reminding students of expectations, providing consistent and frequent feedback, and clear communication, following through with positive and negative consequences. I would recommend differentiating instruction to meet the needs of all learners. One way to accomplish this is through questioning techniques. Teachers can vary questions from recall and comprehension to higher order thinking skills, such as evaluation and analysis. Another strategy is to use small groups. After presenting the lesson to the whole class, Teacher A can group students strategically to give ELs and special needs students more support, and advanced learners can be provided with challenging content and activities. So here's the strong sample response for that question. As principal, I would recommend several classroom management strategies. To begin a lesson, objectives. Notice how the answer starts by rephrasing the question as principal. It is important to answer the CPACE questions as an acting principal. The answer then goes into detail, suggesting specific strategies to help improve student learning and achievement. Each strategy that is recommended has a following achievement criteria that it addresses, such as students are then focused on the lesson, assist with time management, engage students, reminding students of expectations and providing consistency. It's always important to justify any suggestions made by stating the positive effects on student learning and achievement. Notice how the answer starts by rephrasing the question as principal. It is important to answer the CPACE questions as an acting principal. The answer then goes into detail, suggesting specific strategies to help improve student learning and achievement. Each strategy that is recommended has a following achievement criteria that it addresses, such as students are then focused on the lesson, assist with time management, engage students, reminding students of expectations and providing consistency. It's always important to justify any suggestions made by stating the positive effects on student learning and achievement. Notice how the answer starts by rephrasing the question as principal. It is important to answer the CPACE questions as an acting principal. The answer then goes into detail, suggesting specific strategies to help improve student learning and achievement. Each strategy that is recommended has a following achievement criteria that it addresses. Question number 3 from Developing as a Professional Educator. How would you use the information provided by Teacher A's self reflection in your planning? Answer this in 3 to 4 sentences. So, again, taking a look at the teacher's self reflection and using that in your planning to help to build something that the teacher will be receptive to. So, think about the teacher reflection, and you can use sentence frames such as in my planning, I noticed the teacher admitted that, or because the teacher acknowledged a need for improvement in blank, the teacher will be amendable to support in this area. So it's always great to build on something that the teacher is already reflecting on because they're going to be much more to receptive to those recommendations. So let's take a look at the strong sample response provided by CTCE. In my planning, I noticed Teacher A admitted that the learning environment was, quote, chaotic at times. This indicates awareness of off task behaviors exhibited by some students and that Teacher A would be receptive to classroom management strategies. Teacher A acknowledged ways to improve the lesson through hands on activities, building background knowledge for the EL students, and increasing rigor for advanced students. These improvements can be made with differentiating strategies. So notice how the answer relates something that the teacher stated to both specific areas of improvement, classroom management and differentiating instruction. When searching for your areas of improvement in the artifacts, Looking at the teacher reflection first is often helpful so that you can easily relate areas of improvement to ideas the teacher has already noted. This will make the teacher more receptive to suggestions and will give you a stronger response. Developing as a professional educator, question number 4. How will the strategies you recommend lead to improved teaching and learning? You're going to answer this question in 1 to 2 sentences, and you're going to think about the positive effects your recommendation will have on students. So you can use the sentence frame. These recommendations would lead to improved instruction and student learning by, and these can be things like more time on task, more classroom structure, better time management of lesson, meeting the needs of all learners, better data driven instruction, meeting the unique needs of diverse students. Just think about how the recommendations you made and that you already discussed in great detail will lead to improved teaching and learning. It can be very simple and straightforward because you already discussed these things and you already described them in detail. Now you just sort of need to put a bow on it and talk about in 1 to 2 sentences how these recommendations will lead to improved teaching and learning. So here's the strong sample response example. These recommendations will lead to improved teaching and learning by increasing time on task, structuring the lesson with technology to ensure all lesson components are completed, and meeting the needs of all learners. So notice how the answer to this question is straightforward and concise. This is on purpose because each answer already has integrated within it a focus on student learning and achievement. So everything that you've been responding to throughout the essay thus far has already had a focus on student learning and achievement, and you've already described in detail how it's going to have a positive effect on students. So again, this is just putting a bow tie on your answers. So it's important not to wait until this answer to justify how and why recommendations will lead to improved teaching and learning. Answer this question throughout your entire essay, but use this point to really bring it all home. Then, when you arrive at this question, you can simply reiterate what you have been discussing throughout your essay in a concise and direct way. Developing as a professional educator, question number 5. How would you work with teacher A to monitor professional growth and the impact over time on student learning? So this is really about what type of plan would you implement to help the teacher grow, so that you can actually monitor their growth over time and see the impact that they have that your growth plan has on student learning. So you need to think about the types of things, the types of steps that you would take with a teacher to implement a plan. First of all, to think about what the plan is going to be, to implement that plan, to observe that plan in action, and then to follow up on that plan um, throughout the steps. So you're going to answer this in 2 sentences, and you're going to think clearly about the growth plan. What would be helpful to any teacher in their growth plan? This can be very general and very generic to any growth plan in any teacher in any situation. So you're going to talk about reflection, reflecting on what went well in their lesson and what they could improve upon. You're going to set goals. After you reflect, then you set a goal for what can we work on? What are the goals that we want to achieve? Then you're going to think about professional growth opportunities that you can provide for the teacher. You're going to think about peer observation, and you're going to think about informal observation. So, can the teacher go and watch a peer that's really strong in differentiation or classroom management? And when can you come back into the classroom so that you can observe this goal in action and see how it's having a positive effect on student learning? And then you're going to talk about coaching debriefs, or what do you do as a follow up? And how do you discuss how the plan is working in action and how you're working toward those goals? So you can use a sentence structure such as, I would work with this teacher to develop a plan that would include, and you're just going to lay out the growth plan. And it could simply be reflection, goal setting, professional growth opportunities, peer observation, informal observation, and coaching debriefs. And then the second sentence to this is going to be talking about how important it is to support teachers. And if this is a veteran teacher, then you can talk about it's important to always support veteran teachers in their growth as they continue to learn in their classrooms. And if it's a new teacher, you can talk about it's always important to support new teachers in their growth and journey as a professional educator. So here's the strong sample response. I would work with teacher A to develop a plan that would include goal setting, professional growth opportunities, observing other teachers, and follow up meetings and observations. It is important to encourage and support new teachers. So notice how the answer just lists the steps to a professional growth plan, and then it states the importance of supporting new teachers. So the final criteria for your exam is going to state your response should be written for an audience of educators knowledgeable about educational leadership and should be approximately 1,000 to 1,200 words in length. Be specific and detailed in your response, citing evidence as appropriate from the video recording, artifacts, and documents to support your response, and referencing relevant components from the California Teaching Performance Expectations. Your response will be evaluated on the degree to which you demonstrate your ability to effectively apply the California Teaching Performance Expectations to analyze and improve teaching and learning in a California K-12 classroom by using your administrative knowledge, skills, and abilities as defined by the California Administrator Performance Expectations. So that's a lot of words to talk about how long your essay should be. It should be 1,000 to 1,200 words in length. It should be no less than 1,000. If it's less than 1,000, I've heard that sometimes they're not even accepted as a complete answer. If it's more than 1,200 words, also same thing. I've heard that once you reach that 1,200 word length for your answer, that the rest of that answer will not be counted in your actual essay. So making sure that you hit that mark between 1,000 and 1,200 words. And then being specific and detailed in your response, we went over all the specifications and the details that you would need for each one of these questions and the type of evidence that you would need to cite, all the artifacts. Make sure that you actually cite at least one time each one of the artifacts, whether that be the TPEs or the lesson plan or the video or the class profile or the walkthroughs or the work examples from the students. Make sure that you cite them at least one time in any of the sections. And as you saw earlier, that sort of flow chart that I had earlier in the video can be used as a reference to figure out which sections each one of those artifacts works well with. Then make sure that you demonstrate your ability to effectively apply the TPEs. This entire portion is going to be based on the TPEs. So when you answer your question, when you find the strengths and the areas for improvement for your teacher, make sure that there's a corresponding TPE that goes well with them so that throughout your entire essay, there's that thread that you're basing everything around the TPEs. As a reminder, make sure that you relax and that you take deep breaths during the test and know that you do indeed have all of the knowledge and all the tools to complete this exam and that you can pass this exam. I know that there's been many horror stories about this exam, myself included. I've taken it several times and I've failed each time, and different aspects of my failures have been just based on simple things that are easy to fix if you follow each one of these steps. I've even had an experience where I had a full on panic attack during the exam, and I had to stop everything that I was doing and just take a lot of deep breaths and refocus myself. So, if that happens to you, know that you're not alone. This exam is very challenging. It's 4 hours long, and you're writing the entire time and you're focused the entire time for 4 hours straight. And that can be really, really challenging to do. But do know that you have all the right tools, and if you follow all the steps in this video, you're very likely that you will succeed in passing this exam. So good luck and enjoy yourself.